Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's story. In this episode, we'll witness one of the most emotional moments between James and Diep. During her pregnancy, Diep suddenly falls into a deep coma, leaving James terrified that he might lose her forever. In the quiet of that room, with only her faint breaths to remind him she's still here, James finally gathers the courage to confess his love. Words he should have spoken long ago. Will Diep hear him? And will love be enough to guide her back? Make sure to stay with us until the very end to experience the powerful reunion of their hearts. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world. Morning light filtered softly through the wooden shutters, spilling across the room where Diep lay motionless. Her pale face seemed almost translucent in the glow, as if she were caught between worlds. James sat by her side, shoulders slumped, hands trembling as he held hers. His eyes were swollen, rimmed with red from nights without sleep. "Diep," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of fear. "Please, you have to wake up. Don't leave me like this." The faint hum of the village outside went on, as if nothing had changed. Roosters crowing, neighbors sweeping their yards. But for James, time had collapsed into silence. The phone on the table buzzed suddenly, snapping him back. He grabbed it with urgency. "Hong Kong Hospital?" His voice wavered, but carried a firm edge. "Please, I need 2 of your best doctors. Send them right away." He rattled off the address, each word heavy, like he was grasping at the last threads of hope. Hanging up, James turned back to Diep. She lay still, her breaths shallow but steady, like a fragile melody on the verge of breaking. His heart screamed to stay, to guard her every second, but duty clawed at him. The factory, their livelihood, was in turmoil. Mr. John's shipment was under investigation, police questions piling higher by the hour. If James didn't show up, everything he had built with his father could collapse. He leaned down, brushing his lips gently against the back of her hand. "I'll come back, Diep. I promise. My heart stays here with you." His father's voice echoed softly from the corner. "Go, son. I'll look after her. You take care of the factory. She needs you to keep fighting outside, too." James hesitated, his chest tight with conflict. He wanted nothing more than to stay, but he forced himself to rise. Each step toward the door felt heavier than the last. Before leaving, he turned to take in one final image of her, the curve of her face, the quiet rise and fall of her chest, the faint scent of lavender from the blanket she loved. He burned it into his memory, afraid it might be the last. Outside, sunlight washed the narrow village path, yet it couldn't ease the storm raging inside him. He climbed onto his motorbike, the engine coughing to life, and drove off with a heart tethered painfully to the room he had just left. Back inside, his father moved closer to Diep, his weathered hands trembling as he adjusted the blanket over her. He stared at her fragile form, guilt pressing heavily on his chest. Mistakes of the past hung between them, unspoken yet piercing. "I was wrong," he murmured, though she could not hear. "I pray you'll forgive me." Hours later, the sound of footsteps filled the quiet house. 2 doctors from Hong Kong Hospital entered briskly, carrying black medical bags. Their presence seemed to breathe hope into the heavy air. "How's the patient?" one of them asked, his tone calm yet alert. James's father swallowed hard. She was struck on the neck. She's been unconscious for a day now. His voice cracked, the weight of every word revealing his torment. The doctor examined her carefully, fingers brushing over the injury, eyes narrowing with focus. After a long silence, he finally spoke. The injury is not life-threatening. Her heart rate is irregular, but she's stable. It will take time, but she should wake up. Relief washed over the old man, though it didn't erase the guilt carved into his features. He clasped Diep's hand gently, whispering, "You hear that, child? You'll wake soon." Meanwhile, James stood in the noisy chaos of the factory, police officers questioning him about shipments, invoices, and permits. His answers were steady, his posture firm, but his eyes betrayed him. Every pause, every flicker of silence, his mind drifted back to Diep, to the room where she lay waiting, to the words he hadn't yet spoken. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the village, James finally returned home. The doctors had left, leaving behind a fragile thread of reassurance. His father sat quietly by Diep's bed, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "She'll be all right," his father said softly. Though his voice wavered, James sank onto the chair, gripping Diep's hand as though anchoring himself to her. His chest ached with words unsaid, a confession he had carried for too long. Looking at her still face, the dam inside him broke. "Diep," he whispered, tears brimming in his eyes. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I can't keep this inside anymore. I love you." The words hung in the air, raw and trembling, as if they had been waiting for this moment. His tears fell onto her hand, soaking into her skin. "I should have told you sooner. I should have shouted it every day. But I was a coward. Please wake up. Give me the chance to love you the way you deserve." The room stayed silent, save for the faint beep of the monitor tracking her fragile heartbeat. James leaned closer, his forehead pressing against her hand, his body shaking with sobs. From the doorway, his father watched quietly, guilt and sorrow mixing in his eyes. He turned away, unable to bear the weight of the scene. For the first time, he saw his son not as the strong, stoic heir of the family business, but as a man stripped bare by love and fear. Night fell, the small lamp casting a dim glow over the room. Outside, crickets sang in the fields, a stark contrast to the stillness inside. Tung entered quietly, his steps halting as he gazed at Diep. His jaw tightened, anger flaring as he turned to James's father. "Why did she have to suffer like this?" Tung demanded, his voice sharp with fury. "You had everything, status, money, power, yet you let this happen to her, a defenseless girl." The old man lowered his head, shame pressing him down. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I can never forgive myself." His words sliced through the air, heavy with regret. Tung clenched his fists, his chest rising and falling with anger he couldn't release. He looked at Diep once more, then turned away, eyes burning with the injustice of it all. James remained by her side, whispering words she could not answer. His confession hung in the air, fragile yet unbreakable. A bond formed in silence. The night deepened, the lamp flickering faintly. Diep lay still, caught in dreams unknown, while James's love poured into the quiet room like a prayer, unheard perhaps, but unending. The night lingered, shadows stretching long across the small room. James sat unmoving by Diep's bedside, her hand cradled in his as though letting go would mean losing her forever. The faint hum of the lamp above cast a circle of dim light, painting both of them in a fragile glow. His eyes burned from tears, yet he couldn't close them. Every flicker of her breath felt like the most precious sound in the world. "I'll wait," he murmured softly, his voice hoarse. "Even if it takes forever, I'll wait for you to come back to me." Beside him, his father sat quietly, gaze lowered. Shame weighed heavy on his shoulders, the memory of his mistakes pressing into his chest like a stone. He longed to speak, to apologize again, but words felt useless against the silence of the girl lying still before them. Suddenly, the faintest tremor passed through Diep's fingers. James froze, his heart leaping to his throat. "Diep," he whispered urgently, leaning close. For a moment, nothing followed, and despair threatened to drown him once more. Then, her eyelids flickered, ever so slightly. "Diep," his voice broke, raw with joy and disbelief. Her lashes lifted weakly, revealing eyes clouded but alive. Her gaze met his, fragile yet undeniable. James's chest collapsed with relief. Tears streamed freely down his cheeks as he cupped her face with trembling hands. "I'm here," he said, his words tumbling out between sobs. "You're awake. Thank God, you're awake." Diep's lips parted, her voice no louder than a whisper carried on the wind. "James, I'm okay." Her words were faint, but to him they were the sweetest melody he had ever heard. He pressed his forehead to hers, his tears falling like rain. "Don't ever scare me like that again," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I thought I'd lost you." In the corner, his father lifted his eyes, relief flooding them, though still tempered with remorse. He watched as the two clung to each other, the air heavy with both pain and love. For the first time in days, the room felt alive again. Tung, who had lingered by the doorway, allowed himself a small, quiet smile. His anger softened at the sight of Diep's awakening. Without a word, he stepped back, leaving them to their reunion, the sound of the door clicking softly behind him. James pulled back, just enough to see her face, pale but beautiful in the lamplight. "I have to tell you something," he said, his voice steady now, though his heart thundered in his chest. "I already told you when you were asleep, but now I want you to hear it while you're awake. I love you, Diep." Her eyes widened faintly, surprise flickering before a soft, tender warmth filled them. She smiled weakly, her hand squeezing his as though gathering strength. "I know," she whispered. "I heard you, in my dreams." His breath caught, a laugh breaking through his tears. He kissed her forehead gently, holding her as though she were the only thing keeping him alive. "Then promise me you'll never let go. We'll face everything together, no matter what." "I promise," she replied, her voice faint but resolute, carrying a strength deeper than her fragile body suggested. For a long while, they sat in silence, her head resting against his chest, his arms wrapped tightly around her. Outside, the crickets still sang, but the song no longer felt mocking. It was as though the whole world had shifted, aligning with this fragile yet profound moment of rebirth. His father rose quietly, giving them space. From the doorway, he looked back once more, his eyes glistening. The guilt inside him remained, but it was joined now by hope. Hope that perhaps redemption could be found, not through words, but through actions yet to come. The hours passed, the lamp burning low. James refused to leave Diep's side, even as exhaustion weighed heavily on him. He kept watching her, afraid that if he looked away, she might slip from him again. But Diep, though weak, remained awake, her hand intertwined with his. At dawn, light spilled once more through the shutters, this time not as a cruel reminder of despair, but as a gentle promise of a new beginning. Diep turned her face toward the glow, her lips parting in a faint smile. "Do you remember?" she asked softly, "the day we first met at the market? You scolded me for bargaining too much." James chuckled quietly, the sound breaking through the heaviness. "How could I forget? You looked at me like I was the most annoying man alive." Her smile deepened, though faint. "And yet, here you are." "Here I'll always be," he answered firmly. He leaned closer, brushing her hair back from her face. "I thought I lost you yesterday. It was the darkest moment of my life. But now, I'll never take another day with you for granted. Every second matters." Diep closed her eyes, her breathing steadying as she rested in the warmth of his embrace. "I dreamed of you while I was asleep," she admitted. "I heard your voice. It kept pulling me back." "Then I'll never stop talking to you," James whispered with a tender smile. "Even if you're angry, even if you push me away, I'll keep saying it. I love you." She opened her eyes, gazing into his with a depth that cut straight to his soul. "I love you too." The words rang softly, yet they lit James's entire being. He felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted, replaced with a fragile but undeniable hope. The small room, once suffocating with fear and guilt, now felt like a sanctuary of renewal. The past remained, the mistakes, the wounds, the burdens, but they were no longer chains. They were reminders of how precious this moment truly was. Later, when the doctors returned for their morning check, they found Diep sitting up slightly, supported by pillows, James's hand never leaving hers. Her eyes, though tired, carried light. "She's recovering," one of the doctors said with a smile. "It will take time, but she'll be fine." James bowed his head, gratitude flooding him. He looked at Diep, unable to stop smiling through his tears. "Did you hear that? You'll be fine. We'll be fine." Diep squeezed his hand again, her own smile faint but resolute. As the morning grew brighter, Tung returned briefly, carrying a bowl of broth. He set it on the table, his tone gentler now. "She'll need strength. Take care of her." James nodded, his gratitude wordless but deep. The three men shared a quiet moment of understanding. Past anger, past guilt, past mistakes, all set aside for the sake of the girl who had suffered so much, yet still breathed, still smiled, still loved. That night, as the village settled once more into silence, James sat by Diep's side, her head resting against his shoulder. The lamp glowed like a soft moon between them. He whispered promises into the stillness, promises of love, of devotion, of a future where he would never let fear steal his words again. The room, once heavy with despair, now pulsed with hope, and as Diep closed her eyes, drifting into peaceful sleep, James held her close, his heart steady for the first time in days. The darkness no longer felt endless, for in that small room, love had spoken, love had endured, and love had answered